So thank you, everyone. So I'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to the launch of our report on youth-based rights engagement. My name's Jo Rastami. I am the CEO of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition, otherwise known as AYAC. I want to start today with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as to their emerging leaders. And I extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and we recognise their ongoing connection to land, waterways, and air. For people's interest, our acknowledgement of country was actually written by a young person at AYAC, which is why I try and follow it strictly to the word. Before we get started on the launch, I just have a little bit of housekeeping. Just so everyone is aware, the meeting is being recorded. Captions are enabled for all viewers, and we're also going to share the recording with you afterwards. In this session, you'll see a short presentation on our report, and there will be an opportunity to ask some questions at the end of our report author, and we'll also be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question and you want to pop it in there and ask it that way, that's also a really great way to get your question up. I am really excited to share with you our latest report, A Shared Understanding of Rights-Based Youth Engagement, a conversation starter on challenges and opportunities. This report comes at a really critical time. Human rights is very much on the agenda as we look to the wider global context we're all currently living through, but not just internationally. There's also a lot of conversation and debate happening within Australia. Human rights issues and events regularly come to the fore and are spoken about using a whole lot of other types of terms as well, like social cohesion, for example. Importantly to know, this report is being launched at a time when the Australian government is preparing to report to the UN on its obligations to young Australians under the Convention of the Rights of Child. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Dean Farquhar, AYAC's National Youth Engagement Lead and co-author of the report. Dean is a professional youth worker, originally from Northern Ireland, which I'm sure many of you already know, and we probably can't avoid knowing once Dean starts talking. He has a PhD in youth political engagement from the University of Liverpool. He's been working with us here at AYAC for the last 2 years and leading a lot of our youth engagement, sector engagement, and our research reports. So, Dean, I would now like to hand over to you to share some of the insights from our latest report on the importance of rights-based youth engagement and why we need to have this conversation now. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks very much, Jo. And I'm still getting used to other people calling me Dr. Dean Farquhar. Our colleague Oz did that in the week when we were doing a different interview, and it still feels a bit weird. I'm not quite used to it, but I'm sure I'll get a little bit more used to it as we go along. So basically, what I thought I'd start off with today is like, why did we choose this topic? But Joe's kind of covered off on some of the things that I wanted to say there. And I think when we look out at the world today, we can see a lot of polarization, conflict. We hear a lot of conversations around democratic backsliding and that rights are being transgressed. And I think when I've been entering into a lot of conversations recently, people are increasingly questioning just how robust our commitment is to some of these frameworks and some of these institutions. So I just think that really throws it into sharp relief just how urgent it is that we continue to centre that conversation around upholding and advancing the rights of young people in Australia. And I think another thing around the context that we're living in at the minute is that there has been this growing recognition of the need to include young people in decision making across government. In Australia, so we have the Office for Youth that was established a few years ago. We have these steering committee youth advisory groups. So we have these mechanisms for getting youth voice heard or for amplifying youth voice across government. But there's still that evidence that when we actually come to think about rights and what a rights-based approach to that work should look like, some of these frameworks and these models of practice, they do remain misunderstood and contested. And one of the things that we wanted to do was try and maximize the effectiveness of that work by actually building towards some greater level of coordination among key stakeholders, whether that's young people, youth workers, other practitioners, policymakers, because if we want to really embed this work and further it, we should be working towards some shared aspirations. Now, I will probably come on and speak about this a little bit more as we go through the presentation. When we talk about a more shared approach or a more coordinated approach, that doesn't mean that we all have to agree on everything. What it means is we use these rights-based frameworks as our touch points and as our guide so that we can really sort of work towards more shared objectives. We don't have to agree on everything, basically, but we do have some principles that we can work towards. And I will come on and speak that a little bit more in a second. And I will hopefully be able to, yes, there we go. But before I do, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just to discuss why we have flagged this report as a conversation starter. The report by no means offers definitive or representative findings. We focus quite a lot on narrative evidence, and we want to look at some of these possible points of tension and agreement between young people and those that work with them to support their rights. And our main aim here is to open a conversation, just so that we're being very transparent about the evidence that we're using and we're not overclaiming. We had a consultation with 12 young people from all across Australia. We had 12 semi-structured interviews with those working with young people. We also had a national roundtable with young people, practitioners, academics, and policy officers. So that's the basis of this conversation starter, and hopefully today we'll be able to build on it and advance that conversation. So I suppose when we come to this thing and we're sort of thinking, how do we build a more shared approach? One of the things that we were thinking about was, well, we actually have to understand what some of these basic building blocks of a rights-based approach are. And in our report, we highlight three interdependent building blocks. The first one is United Nations frameworks that provide the basis for international human rights standard, such as the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. So that's one of our building blocks. If we're doing a rights-based approach, we can call on those sorts of frameworks. And I think it's also worth mentioning that frameworks like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they are endorsed by over 196 different countries. So there is a general and a strong level of consensus that there's ethical principles and commitments in there that we should be working towards. Another building block is the legislation, domestic legislation, whether that's federal legislation or state and territory legislation, that enshrines certain protections, entitlements, and obligations. And the final one is the various different ethical codes of practice. So that can be codes of practice around safeguarding, it can be codes of practice around youth work that set out these principles for working with young people as rights holders. Now, when we think about a rights-based approach, anybody who is mentioning these different building blocks could say that they're working towards a rights-based approach. However, it's just not quite as simple as that. So in the report, we note how United Nations frameworks might form tensions with domestic legislation, with professional codes of ethical practice. So how these things relate to each other is it can be a little bit contested. It doesn't always just link up. And also what we were sort of mentioning was when we actually think of something like the CROC or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, how we understand each of those individual articles, we might understand them slightly differently. So we do need to be working towards a more sort of shared understanding, discussing with each other and working out what is it that we're actually trying to do with these building blocks. How do we work to assemble them in a way that what we build is actually meaningful for young people? And when we were doing the research, we came out with three key sort of challenges to do that. The first one is a knowledge of rights-based approach to youth engagement. And that's a challenge because we have to think through what are the strengths-based ways that we can ensure that young people are equipped with the knowledge about their rights so that they can meaningfully claim them. When young people's political participation is discussed, there can be a tendency to slip into this deficit-based framing, which is young people aren't really interested in their rights, they don't know enough about politics, they don't know what's going on. Whereas when we actually talk to young people, what we know is young people have a lot of interesting things to say about the world around them. They have their own interests. Many of them actually do engage in those more formal processes, but some of them struggle to connect that knowledge to these more formal language around rights, these more formal political processes. So how do we go about a strengths-based way that they know what these rights are and that they can advocate for their own rights? The second one is how do we ensure that practitioners have that ongoing professional development and engage in that reflective practice so that they're building that technical knowledge and expertise around rights so that they're actually able to advance the work properly. And the final one is how do we make sure decision makers are aware and action their obligations to young people? And this brings us on to another challenge that we're going to talk a little bit more about below non-participation. So if you bear with me, we will get on to talk about tokenism and all that sort of stuff. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about our second challenge, this more shared understanding of the work, which is these contested framings of rights-based approaches, which is what I was kind of talking about a little bit before, about how do we actually get these building blocks assembled in a way that we're working towards a shared goal. And it's important to note that the UN has long sort of acknowledged that there can be these different approaches, and they have set out some basic principles that we can work towards or that can guide our approach. So we have universality and inalienability. So that's like these rights apply to everyone. They can't be given away or traded. They're indivisible, so you can't just cherry pick what right that you are going to work with. You have to like take the whole package. They're interdependent and interrelated, so they often depend on each other. So the right to participation often depends on the realization of the right to education. There's equality and non-discrimination, and participation and inclusion. But also, when we're sort of thinking about how we work towards these approaches, it's not a free-floating thing. All of these rights have to be backed up by the rule of law. So there has to come a point where we say, actually, this isn't just a subjective thing. There's some objective standards here that we have to work towards, some precedents. And when we were sort of sitting thinking about that, we were thinking like this gives a really good set of principles that we can use to guide this work. Um, but even within these principles, and we explore our practice as youth workers and those that work with young people frequently, there's still some tensions that we really need to be working through and opening up for discussion. And some of those tensions or challenges is how do we balance our responsibility to keep young people safe with our responsibility to try and maximize their freedom and their autonomy? And sometimes them things can actually go hand in hand. If you do effective safeguarding, it gives young people that freedom to feel safe and express themselves. But it's important to note that how we actually do that might necessitate some reason given to young people to explain to them the context that we're working in and how we're balancing those different rights and responsibilities. I think as any youth worker will know, there can also be some challenges around balancing child's rights and the rights of parents and carers. So how do we actually do that? If different tensions arise between parents, carers, and youth workers, how do we work through that in a way that is compliant? And this is perhaps a more of a UK sort of challenge here from the UK literature and youth work, which is there can be a bit of a challenge between how we get that balance between that open access youth work, that place-based open access youth work that is open to everyone in the community, and those more sort of targeted forms of engagement through youth advisory groups and consultations where we say that we want to include certain young people from the outset. So that could be another challenge around how we actually put these approaches into action. And then the final one that we were sort of thinking around these contested frameworks is this idea of minimalism and maximalism. So, say, for example, what the right to education might mean for one person, how we realize that right might be different to another person. Another person might like, say, a more comprehensive set of measures. And what we sort of are trying to sort of get at with this in our research is saying the fact that these tensions exists, it's not a failure. They're just sites for deliberations. They're sites for us to come together as practitioners to share knowledge, to share insight, and work through them. And a part of actually doing a meaningful rights-based approach that really meets the needs of young people is that we actually surface these things and we take them seriously. And I'll just come on to our final challenge, which is the challenge that I suppose a lot of people on the call will be quite familiar with, which is the charge of non-participation, obviously associated with Roger Hart. And that's thinking, how do we move beyond forms of participation that are manipulative, that are just using young people as decoration for photo ops for politicians or decision makers, and tokenism, where basically they're seen to be given some form of authority, but oftentimes decisions are made before they really get to have any sort of input into the process. But when we were thinking about this as a challenge, we were also building off some of the work of Laura Lundy, which is that tokenism itself can sort of justify an action. So we can think, oh, we don't want to involve young people in that. That's a tokenistic project. Or we're not going to do that. That's not going to be meaningful. And what we really wanted to do with this research was think, actually, we can always move beyond tokenism. Tokenism should never, it's a challenge, but it should never justify an action. When we're responsive, reflective, and really committed to working with young people, we can always move beyond it. So it should never justify in action. And I think this is the sort of the crux of it here is how do we align the engagement techniques with rights-based models of practice? And how do we set up those feedback loops, those modern evaluation processes that center youth voice and demonstrate evidence of power shifting? So when we were thinking about that move towards a more shared approach, those were our three big challenges. How do we make sure that we have the knowledge? How do we make sure that we're actually committing to collaboratively working through any tensions around interpretations that arrive? And how we actually getting the engagement process and techniques right so that we're moving beyond that tokenism and that charge of non-participation. So what I want to do now is quickly run through some of the key points for reflection, having listened to the young people who participated and the practitioners who participated. These were the key things that we sort of found in answer to those three challenges and how we can help move beyond them. So, rights-based youth engagement is a reason-giving practice. We must always be reasoning, what rights is it that we're talking about? How are they being advanced? What are the policies and procedures that are being put in place? What are the engagement techniques? We always have to be open to giving reasons about what we're doing. We can't just say we're doing rights and that's it. We have to be able to explain it and give those reasons. And this is a point that I came on to at the start because I think it's a very important point. A more shared understanding does not require uniformity. Progress towards rights-based youth engagement requires transparency and openness to negotiate and difference within the terms and provisions of the frameworks. Everybody doesn't have to agree on all things. What matters is we're using these principles and these frameworks as touchstones, as our starting point for that process of deliberation and discussing where we work through these things and center what is in the best interest of young people. Another one that we came up with is knowledge gaps about rights matter, but the deficit framings don't help. It's not going to help if we're saying young people aren't interested in the rights. Young people transparently are interested in the rights. The point that we need to be centering here with this work is how are we actually going about creating the pathways for them to claim the knowledge that actually allows them to put those rights into practice. So how do we actually go about making that meaningful? Another little point for reflection that we had is thin rights-based approaches weaken both practice and politics and policy, sorry. And this is what I was saying before. It's like we in youth work, everybody can be making a claim to be doing rights, and we can say this is rights-based, we're rights-based practice. But just saying that we're rights-based isn't enough. We need to know how specific rights are being advanced, what those engagement techniques are, what are the policy programs. Because if we aren't doing that more thick, that more reason-based approach, it can limit the depth, credibility, and the impact of the work. And as I was saying before there, these interpretive tensions are unavoidable. They should be surfaced rather than suppressed. We need to work through what these actually mean in practice. And I think if we're to make these things real for practitioners, we have to acknowledge the everyday life and the everyday challenges of that work and not see it as a failure that we're having to have a discussion on how do I balance my safeguarding responsibilities with my desire to give that young people that young person that additional bit of freedom, or how do I make sure I'm working to through those parent care young person those possible tensions in the best way. And again, this will not surprise anyone, this next little point of reflection, but I think it is a little hopeful point, which is there is agreement between young people and adults. We come at the work from different vantage points. So a lot of the practitioners that we interviewed were very interested and highly aware of these interpretive tensions, whereas young people were much more concerned about the outputs and the experience of the engagement. But we do have these shared common expectations around dignity, respect, transparency, and meaningful influence. So there is that basis there between us to move forward towards a more sort of shared approach. And I think this is our last sort of few, which is again just rounding off on things that we've said. Tokenism is a real risk, but it can never justify an action. We can always move beyond tokenism, but we can't do that if we haven't at least started the process. And this is another little point here with regards to tokenism, which is if we're doing rights-based engagement to show that we have moved beyond tokenism, we need to evidence power shifting. We need to be able to demonstrate how young people have shaped agendas, processes, and decisions. If we can't do that, then we can't really say that we're actually moving beyond tokenism. And finally, language matters. We need to be practical and accessible. Young people who are interested in the cost of living or they're interested in unfairness in schools, they're interested in rights, but it's how we actually link those rights and those frameworks in an accessible way. So me saying Articles 28 and 29, education, there's a different way that we can have that conversation where we can support them, link those rights to their everyday lives. And a more shared understanding emerges through thoughtful practice and the exchange of ideas, which is really what we're hoping to do today is basically say, here's some general things that we can do to actually make this better, but we still need that reflection, that feedback, that learning, and we need to involve young people, practitioners, and decision makers in that. That's something that's there for all of us to do. And hopefully, I think I have ran slightly over my time, but hopefully not by too much. So I'll just wrap up with a little reflection on how we want to keep this conversation going at AYAC. At AYAC, over the last few years, we've released a number of reports, all of which would advance the recommendations within which would advance rights-based youth engagement. We've looked at national youth strategies, rights-based youth impact assessments, national parliaments, youth quotas. We've advocated for harnessing the expertise of the youth sector within those formal government consultations. We've also put together quite a lot of stuff about civics in schools. All of these things would advance rights-based youth engagement. But with this report, we didn't just want to be saying the same things over and over again. So what we've actually done is just give some short practical tips that decision makers within government can pick up and implement that in a very simple way that would actually really sort of embed the work, which is across the design, delivery, and evaluation of projects. At the design stage, they can ensure that funding application and delivery plans set out how specific rights intend to be upheld in advance through the engagement process. Within the delivery process, they can ensure that some time is baked in to have those discussions around how the work actually relates to rights and what the process is actually doing to advance those rights. And then in evaluations, it can be set out that any evaluation has to include evidence that details how attempts were made to shift power between young people and autonomy to shape the terms of their engagement. And another one that, again, it comes from sort of youth work and monitoring evaluation within youth work is we also advocate for centering the voice of young people through narrative evidence and case studies so that we can actually get what they're getting out of the experience. And this is going to sound like a really silly little thing, but at the end of every session that I do with a young person, and this is how simple that could be, I ask them three questions. What did you enjoy? What, if anything, did you learn? And what would you change? And we always focus in on that, what would you change? Because that's how we want to show that we're taking what they say seriously and shifting the power to them. But anyway, I have gone over because Nelly is very kindly in the background telling me that I'm talking too much. So what I'll do now is I'll pass back over to Joe, and hopefully that was a good sort of overview of what we've done.
Thanks, Dean. We do have time for just only a couple of questions because we have gone over and I do want to get to a couple of other points. But firstly, I have a question for you myself, and it won't surprise you because it's something that this whole piece of work around developing a shared understanding and what you'd refer to as the interpretive tensions and things, But one of the things is that I've really noticed this process has sort of brought up is that we all think human rights are important. You ask anyone, we all think we need to uphold young people's rights. But sometimes in explaining and in explaining this work to stakeholders, I've noted is that a lot of people that we might deal with, and I'm thinking more so like external stakeholders, maybe we work on a council and we're talking to other people who don't work with young people. Maybe we're talking to government, etc., etc. But why is it important and how does it actually improve the outcome of what people are wanting to do? So I guess my question is around why should we do it? How does it actually improve those young people's actual, input and their experience and then the information we get? Because I feel like that's missing. We all say it's important, but we're not able necessarily to communicate why.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think one of the subtle differences with the rights-based approach is, firstly, is that it says that even if you don't think that those things are going to happen from this engagement, you still have to at least ask. Like that is your responsibility. So, but I think one of the benefits of the rights-based approach is actually if you're working with young people in a way that upholds their dignity, which gives them more of a say over what they're doing, that is that commitment there to meeting them where they're at. What you find is they get more out of the engagement process. They build their confidence more. They work together better. They feel more able to speak up. So there's a whole host of different outcomes there. But that when you're actually working with them in that right space and building those meaningful relationships in that way, it gives them that more confidence through the engagement process. But what that also means is because they're actually able to open up and to tell you what they think and tell you what they feel, you're actually getting more honest feedback from them. And if you're getting that more honest feedback, you're going to be more able to design policies and procedures and systems that actually meet their needs. So it's not just, oh, it is that it's their responsibility to do these things. But if you do these things well, if you uphold their dignity, if you give them those safe spaces to
Mm.
speak out, you will improve outcomes, not just in terms for each individual young person, in terms of their confidence, their communication skills, all of those other different things, their networks, but you will also improve the systems because the systems are getting more accurate evidence around what the needs of young people actually are.
Thanks, Dean. I've really noticed with this report that it's obvious to all of us, but I guess when we're communicating about why we do things or why should we ensure all of these other factors so that young people can actually have their rights upheld, others don't necessarily understand that. So I think that's, to me, something really important that's underpinning this work. I'll just check in with the chat if we have any questions or if anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question. Now is your chance. I won't have a lot of time, but if you do have a question and you want to ask, just raise your hand.
Yeah, there's one there in civics education, and we did actually because we did the submission to civics inquiry and we got the outcomes of what they're hoping to implement, and there was some things in there that we had put forward, but I can't remember exactly what the list of recommendations for that were. The civics question there.
We can share it
You can share it. Yeah.
directly with you afterwards, Matthew. Um, we probably, unless someone's got a burning question they want to ask, I'm conscious that we did say this would only run for half an hour. So I'll just do I will offer that if you have a question after reading the report, we really want to see all of our work as a fairly active way to engage with our stakeholder network. So if you have a question, you want a clarification, you want more information, please email us directly. And I know Dean would love to respond to any questions or queries that come his way. So please don't worry about not asking a question. We would get to you. So I'm going to finish up now because there's a couple of things that I do really want to mention while I've got you here. Um, I want you all to look out for an email that will come today, and in that will include the full version of our report. Please share that with people that you think would be interested or needs to learn more about the topic. In the email, we've also got a really fantastic blog piece by one of our youth board members, Lena, I think she really nails it. So I'd encourage you all to read that as well. And we also have a link to an interview that we conducted earlier this week between Dean and the new UN Youth Rep. So look forward to that. And before finishing up, I want to let you know as well about some upcoming work. Our next piece of work is going to be on youth workplace rights. So developing on from this topic, there's obviously so much more that we can do, but as part of this, we're going to hold our next National Youth Practitioners Network event as a roundtable, and it will be on that topic. We're going to have a young person, a sector professional, an academic, and a policy professional as part of it. And it's on the 16th of April. So we'll also include that and promote that, please. Directly following this event, and this as equally important as attending the roundtable and learning more about workplace rights, this is more of a personal AYAC plea that I'd really love everyone's support for. We're hosting a sector networking event with the Department of Education's Office for Youth. They're going to share their process for the next iteration of their youth engagement engage strategy, and they're going to seek your input. We'd really appreciate your support and attendance if you can, not only as it's a great opportunity for you to contribute to that and share your thoughts, whatever they may be, but it's also going to really help us as an organisation. Our role as an organisation funded by the government is named up in that strategy, and our current deed is due to finish at June. Now, whilst we're currently advocating for the next iteration of our deed, any support that you can provide would really be welcome. And I feel that asking questions through the sector networking opportunity is one way that would really demonstrate to people the value of AYAC and also your interest in their work. And I guess part of that is that ongoing engagement and holding people to account for, doing the best thing by Australian young people. So please look out for the upcoming youth participation opportunities as well on the workplace rights work, but also we're going to be supporting, hopefully, fingers crossed, some consultations in support of the Australian Child Rights Task Force as they develop their independent submission to the UN on youth rights. So lots happening here at AYAC. We'll share more information with you on all of these various topics through our newsletters and online. And we appreciate your support today, and hopefully we'll see you at our upcoming events as well. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dean. Bye.